Welcome to another special report from Catholic Family News. I'm Brian McCall, the editor in chief, and I'm going to be joined today for the first time on our program by Conor Gallagher. Conor has a master's in philosophy as well as a Juris Doctorate degree from the Catholic University of America. He is currently has been for 17 years at Tan Books, which will be a name a lot of our viewers are aware of. He saw that into its transition out of bankruptcy and has now been running that. He's also the author of a book I read several years ago, If Aristotle's Kid Had an iPod, which was recommended to me by Father McMahon, the headmaster of La Salette Boys Academy. I think he had all the boys read it and he recommended it to the parents. But we're going to talk to him today, particularly about his new book, which is A Well-Ordered Family, which brings philosophy and practical advice to you in a very readable book. So, welcome, Conor. We're happy to have you join us today.
Oh man, I cannot believe you referenced if Aristotle's Kid Had an iPod. It made that you just made my day. That was my first book, and I had no idea, Brian, that iPods would go out of popularity so quick. I should have said iPad or iPhone. But thank you for referring to that book and hearing that people had, the boys read it and the priest was reading it. It makes my day. I loved writing it, and that's what kind of started my writing career.
Well, that's great. I know all of my sons read it when they were there, and I did. So, but I did think the same thing. I thought, well, if you just picked iPhone or iPad, it would have
Second edition's coming, buddy.
exactly.
We're going to do a second edition. And in
Great.
fact, a second edition is needed
Yes.
because that's 12 years old now.
Yeah.
Can you believe that? 12 years old. And the statistics on the digital disaster that we have and the
Yes.
anxiety and the depression and the addictions, it is so much worse that this book warrants updates and new editions because culture keeps getting worse. So yeah,
Yes.
there'll be a second edition and I'm going to send you a copy.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, if we can, I'd like to start our conversation by just talking to you a little bit about Tan Books before we get into your current book. I know a lot of reviewers are like me. When I had my wife and I had our reversion to the church, our kind of finding tradition, coming back to the faith. There were two things some people we met recommended. They said, you have to subscribe to Catholic Family News and get a Tan Book catalog. And this is in the 90s. I mean, I think the mailman was sick of coming to our house with heavy boxes because I think we probably ordered almost everything in the catalog at some point. But he was always delivering. He's like, "You get a lot of books, guys." So they really were a great source for us of not only contemporary writing about what was going on now, but reprints of classic spiritual writing and things to nourish us. So, how did you get involved in that? And just tell us a little bit about what it was like kind of saving the organization that produced the good books out of the bankruptcy situation.
So my dad, he had been a successful businessman for a long time, a family business that had been going 70 something years at that point. He was a Tan fan. He had read the books himself. And I'm off practicing law. And he calls me one day and he says, "Hey, I heard that." Well, let me back. Sorry. He wanted to always get into Catholic publishing. So we started something called St. Benedict Press.
Mhm.
And we started publishing a handful of books. We had a Bible. It really wasn't going anywhere, but it was a startup, right? And he called me. I was practicing law, and he said, "How about you come and represent St. Benedict Press as like my lawyer,
Mhm.
essentially, and help us acquire Tan Books out of bankruptcy?" So St. Benedict Press would be acquiring Tan into itself. And so I was like, well, that sounds like a whole lot more fun than working at some big law firm. So so I did. And so really I went to work not for Tan. I went to work for this startup that my dad and his partner had started. And I remember like we had $22,000 in sales. So it was a startup. I mean, that was it. And so, but then Tan, I think it was in bankruptcy for the second time.
Mm.
And we knew that they had a backlist that we loved. We knew that there was a devoted followership. And so it took about a year to consummate that deal through the bankruptcy court, and we got it. And, Brian, I was a lawyer and I had a philosophy degree. And, one good thing that comes out of those two educations is the ability to teach yourself stuff. Like you learn how to
Yes.
self-educate, right?
Yes.
And so I had learned, especially as a law clerk, working for a federal judge, it's sort of like you got to learn this kind of complex stuff really quickly and help the judge make a decision. So I really had become like a professional researcher, and I didn't even know it, but I really was like a
Mm.
professional researcher. That shows the divine providence in this, because I had never taken a business class. I had never taken an accounting class, but Almighty God knew that one day I was going to be in charge of a business, and it happened to be TAN. And so he trained me in educating myself. And so I studied and I read every big business book out there. I counted them one time years later, and I stopped counting, around 250 business books. So I consumed a tremendous amount of information to learn how to run a business. I was terrified of failing at running a business, right? But I found and I call it this. Now I'm speaking to a real natural law theorist, so take my words with a grain of salt, Brian. Okay, but I found the natural law of business, and I was searching for it. I was saying, what are the key principles that every business success requires? And so my learning how to run TAN was not just learning like the traditions of the church and the beautiful books by the saints. And I fell in love with it. It was, even for me, I was a devout Catholic, but it was
Mm.
almost like another conversion, and really falling in love with the tradition of the church. And I was like, I had no idea how blessed I was to get TAN. And over time, that became more and more evident to me. But I had to learn the natural order of how to run something. Grace builds
Mm.
on nature. I had to perfect the natural virtues, as Aristotle would call them, of excellence of running a business. And so that's really what I focused on. And then ultimately, Brian, I applied that to running my family. And that's why I came up with Well-Ordered Family. So that's the connection between
Mm.
a law background and then TAN and then Well-Ordered Family.
Wow, excellent. Well, I have to say, I have tough clients when I practice law, but I can't imagine having your dad as a client. That had to be a tough thing to do. But interesting. You read that that you said that. I don't know if you ever knew Thomas Nelson, who founded it. Obviously, a great person, because again, in those early days in the '90s, when he started the '80s and '90s, there was not a lot out there publishing these things. Really foresight in that, but I think anybody who knew Tan and knew Thomas Nelson knew he was not a great business guy. And I think that's great that you were able to bring that business discipline, to the organization. But I don't. Did you ever get to meet him, or hear about the early days of Tan?
You've asked me a very important question.
Mm.
And like, I'm not going to say I'm going to tear up, but there's only a handful of questions that kind of make me almost want to tear up when it
Yeah.
comes to business. So
Mm.
when you buy a company out of bankruptcy, you usually don't become friends with the former owner, okay?
Right.
Because
Right.
it's so I didn't talk to Tom Nelson for years. I didn't know him,
Wow.
but maybe 3 years ago, I had heard that the man, I was living, and by the way, stood originally for Thomas A. Nelson. Like it was,
Yes.
I mean,
Yep.
so I was living under this man's initials, and I kind of felt like my father is, I'm continuing on his wonderful legacy. But in another way, I felt like I was continuing on Tom Nelson's legacy, and I didn't even
Mm.
know the guy.
Mm.
So about 3 or 4 years ago, Brian, I learned that Tom, Mr. Nelson, had a stroke, and he was in a retirement home up in Chicago, near Chicago, like in Rockford, Illinois. And
Right.
so I flew up there. I got permission. I met with one of his friends, and I flew up there just to meet him.
Wow.
And he's still alive. And I went there and I sat with this man, and it was one of the most important hours of my life. And just he couldn't communicate a whole lot because of his pretty severe stroke. And I have differences with Tom. I have differences in theology with Tom. I have differences on a number of things, but we were able to set all that aside. And I wanted to thank this man for how he preserved the traditions of the church. And I think he went too far in some ways. I do. And that's a whole nother conversation. But I wanted to thank this man for what he
Wow.
did. And I wanted to promise him that I saw it as my moral duty and my calling from God to continue the legacy that he started. And that has sparked kind of a beautiful friendship. We don't talk a lot. We talk more through an intermediary
Mhm.
because of his illness. but that's a very powerful moment in my life, and I'll never forget it. And I plan on going back and seeing him in the next few months, so that I keep a relationship with Tom.
Wow, that's a very touching story. That is, and again, I did some bankruptcy work, and you're right. That's the first time I think I've heard of someone who bought a business out of bankruptcy becoming friends with the
Yes.
prior owner. So,
The
well,
greatest
let's.
compliment, I'm sorry, but
Yep.
no one ever asked me this.
Oh,
So I have to just, the greatest compliment I've ever received, other than maybe my wife saying I do or something, you know, is Thomas Nelson told his friend to email me that he knew that God chose the right person to lead TAN. Now, whether
wow.
he's right, I'm not bragging about that,
Right.
but the fact that this man, I wanted him to have that experience because I want him to have confidence that his legacy is going to continue. I was so pleased, not for myself to be complimented, but for him to have the satisfaction that his legacy would continue. That was extremely important to me. And it meant the world to me that he had that positive feeling.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. I thank you for sharing that. Um, with that, though, I think we're going to transition over to your most recently published book, "The Well Ordered Family," which surprisingly you can find at Tan Books
And
and other
also
places, and
wellorderedfamily.com. That's kind of the,
wellorderedfamily.com. Yes.
yeah.
But as you know, as you know, Aristotle is a philosophy of realism because, in addition to ideas, virtue has to be practiced, and Aristotle very emphasizes that you need practical experience as part of the process of learning philosophy, and it's really amazing that you could write this book with having no practical experience with families. I mean, you only have 16 children, how did you do that? No, I'm kidding. But you are a father of 16 children, which we have a small medium family. We have 6 children. Is how, and I love doing that to like modern secular birth control people. Like, oh, we have a small medium family. Oh, really? What do you have? One or two? Oh, we have 6. Oh my gosh, that's so big. But maybe if you can explain for us your background and motivation for writing this book. What gave you the idea for putting it together?
Yeah. So I saw this natural law, I'll call it, of business. And there's key principles that apply to running any business successfully. And I was going home and kind of seeing, my wife does an amazing job at home, but I saw that like she could benefit a little bit from basic business principles,
Yeah.
like going home and seeing, telling random people to do random chores every night. I'm like, I think we need a chore chart. Like I can't go into the office and tell people random things. So and she fully embraced this. I'm not saying she didn't do that. It's just out of control with so many kids sometimes, right? So, I started saying, well, what else from work can I bring home? And part of this was simply an ego trip for me, Brian, because I was like the man at business. I was man at work, kind of good at work. People saw me in my like forte. And then I go home and I'm a bumbling moron that doesn't know what to do. And I'm waiting for my wife to tell me what to do. So I kind of felt like a loser at home, but kind of awesome at work. And I'm like, why do my colleagues get to see me on my A game, but my wife never does? And so I kind of wanted to protect my ego at home a little bit and say, okay, honey, I actually know how to get stuff done. I know how to plan. I know how to strategize. I know how to resolve problems and conflicts. I do it at work. Let me try to do it at home. So it was almost me like bringing the executive Conor to the most important organization that I have. I mean, and then just the analogies really started kicking in. I mean, my wife and I are like founders of an organization called the Gallagher family. It's almost like we're entrepreneurs of this entity. And if we were forming a coffee shop, Brian, we would be asking ourselves, what's our vision? What's our meeting schedule? What's our systems? What's our scorecard to track important metrics? All this stuff. But instead at home, we just kind of do it willy nilly. So I started saying, how much of this can I bring home? And that was slowly the beginning of the well ordered family. And I would test. All the kids are my lab rats, right? So I would test little parts, and then eventually I sat down and wrote the book.
Well, so if and maybe you won't mind because I know some guests do, but being a lawyer, you'll be okay with this. I'm going to play devil's advocate for the moment,
Yeah.
and raise an objection. See how
Yep.
you would respond. So you just said how you brought these ideas home from work. Anyone who looks at the book and has had any experience with sort of organizational management or business education says, "Oh, this looks very familiar. It's a lot of these having a vision statement, etc." So what do you bring this into like family life for? Isn't that demeaning to the family, subjecting it to these sort of secular business principles? Shouldn't, if God is giving grace to the family, shouldn't you just know what to do?
Excellent question. So
Yes.
here is the I reply, use the reply one, or what is it?
Right.
How does he say in the Summa cogito? Like I
Good.
think, or I say.
Yes.
So so uh Aquinas says grace builds upon nature.
Mm.
And Tan provides you all the grace, like, it provides you products about the sacramental life, the liturgical life, the devotional life. And the fact of the matter is one thing that makes Catholics different from non-Catholics is our appreciation sometimes for, that the ancient Greece has a place to roll in our faith, right? I mean, so we have taken the natural order of things and built upon it. And that's where philosophy fits so well into theology. So what I'm saying is the natural order has a really important place. That's why we have to build on the natural order, and then the grace flows more freely. So corporate America does a lot of evil things. We know that. But they are darn good, Brian, at setting a vision, getting a team aligned around that vision, setting systems and metrics in place, and dealing with conflict when it arises to accomplish their goal. And that goal might be, let's destroy the world. I mean, who knows what it is, but they're really good at it. And we need to be smart enough to say, corporate America has really simplified these processes and process management. I mean, the fact that Toyota can produce a car as good as its Toyota car is an amazing feat of human achievement. And it's based on certain principles. So I've tried to take that and say, hey, look, the assembly line of the Gallagher family, like we're spitting out something at the end a whole lot more important than a car. And I have found that whether you're trying to become a great athlete, a great musician, a great business, a great anything, you adopt certain principles of excellence in order to accomplish that. And I think that for some reason we're particularly bad at it at home, because at home is where we expect to rest. Home is where we expect to not have to put on a show, and it's like a safe spot, and that's where we get lazy. And yes, I want people to relax at home, but your family, especially talking to the gentleman out there, the family needs your A game even more so than your colleagues and your customers.
Hmm. It's interesting when you were saying that. It reminded me when I was reading the book to prepare for this. It reminded me a thought that came to mind of a book I read a while ago. It's an old book by Douglas Hyde called Dedication and Leadership, and he was a former communist, Hyde, and he became a convert, became Catholic. And essentially what he says in the book is like the communists have got the worst message. Like it's horrible. How, like everybody should be saying, why would we want that? It's terrible. Catholicism has the greatest message, but we're terrible at the process of actually doing things and explaining to people and recruiting people and getting people excited and getting them involved and having organization. And he said, I was in the Communist Party. I was, organizing these incredible events, bringing people here, and I converted, and I was like lining up chairs in the back room for like 4 people to show up to a meeting. And he said that we really can learn from the means or these techniques, even if they have been employed for a bad message, because the people with the bad message are going to win otherwise. So I don't know. I just wanted to. It reminded me of that book a lot. Reading yours, that
Yeah.
advice on means is important.
Yeah. And we have to remember that like human activity is human activity.
Mm,
And whether you're Sun Tzu tapping into the strategies of how to conquer your
yeah.
enemy, or whether it's your, Lenin trying to figure out how to make the Communist Party survive or thrive, or whether you're a dad or mom at home. I mean, like human activity is human activity, and we're motivated by ultimately the same things. We need the same kind of look. A communist needs to eat food just like anyone else does. They need community. They need a
Mm.
vision. They need inspiration. They need meetings. They need processes in place so they know what they're doing. They need metrics to kind of know how to measure success. Guess what? That's what a saint needs to accomplish heaven. And that's what mom and dad need to live a more harmonious, peaceful life with their children.
Mm. Well, maybe let's jump in a little bit to the book, give people a taste for some of the things in it. And for that, this is your website you mentioned earlier, Well Ordered Families, and this picture is on the front of the book. It's the sort of the Well Ordered Family Wheel, and maybe just to help us, let's pause on just the first one, vision. So, why would a family need a vision? And why wouldn't that vision just be, we're all going to go to heaven? So maybe give us a little insight into what you bring to that discussion of the family vision.
Vision is the ability to see which is not there yet. So sight is like, seeing this microphone in front of my face. Vision
Right.
in the Oxford English Dictionary is seeing that which has not yet happened. And so the idea of a visionary, even in a Catholic standpoint, a mystical visionary, one who sees apparitions, they're seeing what can happen or what's beyond the veil of the physical world.
Mm.
Families need visionaries to where you're able to see this is why God created this family. This is the purpose, the divine purpose of the Gallagher family. If we strive, we can reach this. We get stuck too much in the day to day. This is the best way, talking about vision for your family. What's your 10-year portrait of your family? What's your 3-year goals? What's your ultimate long-term vision? I think these are important because it forces your brain it does a mind trick. It forces your brain to work on your family versus in your family. And
Mm.
business guys will talk about, like, I got to go off to the beach and do a golf trip with my buddies, to think on the business versus in the business. Or a lone entrepreneur has to get out of the office and go to Starbucks to work on the business versus in the business. And it's very, very true, Brian. I mean, I know that's the case. What I'm saying is mom and dad, 99.9999% of their time is working in the family, soccer practice, dinner, paying bills. We need to separate ourselves from the family, elevate above it, look at it, look at the ultimate destination, and work on the family, which is why, Brian, I created a coaching service to like help families do this. Help them, just ask them questions and get mom and dad talking about the long-term goals of their family. So that's part one. That's vision. That's why
Mm.
vision's important.
So on that, and maybe you could share in your experience, because I think you're absolutely right. If you don't spend time thinking about the big picture, where do we want to go? You just get caught up in putting out fires and dealing with the crisis. But do you have any practical advice for people who say, we can't find the time. How my wife and I, okay, we need to do that, but this kid has to go here. We have this doctor's appointment. We have this. What's some practical advice on how to find the time to go work on the family with your wife?
The honest answer is difficult, but
Mm.
it's the honest answer is that's bullcrap. Like, it's just, I'm serious. Look at this. We spend how many, do not tell me, mom and dad, this is the only time I'll ever get like aggressive, right? Do not tell me you don't have time to work on your family. No, you don't have time to do other stuff. You have time to work on your family. This is the same thing to me as somebody saying, like, I don't have time to pray. I'm too
Mm.
busy. What saint has ever gotten away with that one? You know what I mean? So I'm not saying that this is prayer. I'm not saying this is more important than prayer, but prayer is like working on your life as opposed to working in your life. And, this kind of thing is also how many, this is a simple trick. Mom, dad, busy. I get busy. Okay. I even wrote a book called You're Never Too Busy. It's sitting right here. But here's the thing. Do not tell me you don't have a couple hours a month, an hour a month, an hour every quarter to do coaching or attend webinars with your husband and work through these tools that I've created. Just go to your phone and look under notifications or screen time and find out how much screen time you spent in the last 30 days. How many hours
Mm.
of screen time is on your device right now? And then you tell me you don't have time to work on your family. Like we lie to ourselves. And I'm not going to accept that any modern person doesn't have time for this. Look, how much time is on Netflix? How much time's on podcasts? How much time is driving in the car, going and shopping for something that's not necessary? There is time, my friends, and you have to take ownership of that. Otherwise, you're playing the victim card that the world's so busy and pulling and pushing you. You gotta toughen up and recognize there's plenty of fluff time in your schedule. Something else has to give. You don't have time for something else. You do have time to work on your family. And that's the only time I kind of get aggressive, Brian. So I'll calm down now.
That's all right. That's the lawyer coming out in you.
I'm pleading my case.
Right. So maybe if we can jump a little bit, I know we're not doing the order, and that's why you really need to read the book,
okay,
because they build on each other. But systems, and you have a good chapter on why family needs to have systems. And um, it's interesting. One of the things, the modern world, where you either have one cat, or you have maybe one child or two children 5 years apart, you can sort of cover up the problem and get away with a lack of systems and organization, because maybe you're 2-on-1 for your one kid. But once you cross the line, and for us, it was like 4 children. Once you cross 4, you sort of see a need for, we need something more. We need something to help organize this and not just be swept along. Um, but what would you say to people who say, "Yeah, I've tried that. We went and bought this chore chart. Then we had a behavior chart for a while. We did that, and it didn't quite work out. So we had to try something else." Is it really possible to have a system, or are these all just gimmicks to kind of make you feel better for a little while?
It's a great question. And the answer to that is no, they've never tried what I have, because what I have has never been done before. And I'm serious about that. It's a unique product. And so, yeah, a lot of families have chore charts,
Yep.
but this is what the primary thing about systems, Brian. I talk about macro systems and micro systems. All right,
Yep.
macro systems. Yeah, whenever people say, "Ooh, systems, tell me how to get the dishes done." Yes, I have methods to help with that, but that ain't the problem, folks.
Right.
The problem is what I call the 6 external forces in your life that are coming in at you like barbarians, banging down your gate and breaking down your walls, and they got ladders climbing up over. And the 6 external forces are coming at you. And I call this the strep test. And I have a test to help you analyze these 6 factors in this acronym. Strep. Every family has strep. It's a threat. Social environment. That's the S. What's your kid's social life? How are they getting sucked into a certain group? Maybe that's the neighbors next door. Maybe it's the kids at school. Technological environment. You have to look at technology as its own little environment. And it's got the aspects of environment, and it like feeds the kids, and it attaches to them, and they carry it around in their pocket now. And you have gaming, where video games are not just video games. It's like on the internet and you're talking to some dude in India,
Yeah.
So technology is its own environment, and you need to look at it, mom and dad, and say, okay, this is our technological environment. What do we need to do about this? So that's STR. Recreational, like the sports can get way out of hand. Your kids, if they're in sports, but the older they get, it's its own environment, and you need to manage that environment. Religious, what's your parish life like? What's your prayer life like? What's your faith life like? Educational, what school system, what curriculum? That's another environment that they find themselves in. And of course, professional is the P. And that's not just mom and dad's job. That's also the kid's job when they get the first job down at the bagel shop, down the road. That's a whole nother environment that they've stepped into. So these 6 external factors, strep, come together and make what I call your family ecosystem. And what I'm saying, because an ecosystem, Brian, is a bunch of little environments coming together and making one self-sustaining thing. We have to manage those environments. That's the ultimate system of your family. And that's once you start looking at each one individually and saying, okay, this one's strong. Okay, social life's pretty good. Technology is completely out of control. Our parish life is great. Education needs some improvement. Recreation is fine now, but the more older kids you get, they're all doing travel soccer. We're losing our minds, with sports. this is the common thing. You need to look at each one and make improvements and take ownership. So I say parents have to be the architect of their ecosystem. You must build the environments that your family is in. That's the primary focus of systems. And one last point, the micro system that I really more important than chores. Okay. The problem in American family is not that the dishes don't get done. Okay. A major problem is the technology. And so I have a digital policy builder. And here's the primary purpose of systems thinking. If you tell yourself, I don't really have a digital policy, I'm saying you're incorrect. You do have a digital policy, and it's entrust your kids to the internet. That's your system. That's your system. And you say, well, I haven't really, fleshed it out. Okay, well, then what you have all this gray matter and you're allowing your kids to be owned by the internet. Now your system stinks. So let's make improvements, So the digital policy builder, this tool that I created that you can get for free on wellorderfamily.com, it's to help you think through the technological questions you have to ask. When are they allowed to use tech? With who? For what purpose? Et cetera, et cetera. That will put you in the driver's seat of the technology environment that is attacking your family. So those are examples of systems, much more important than when does the lawn get mowed.
Well, with that, and I'd like to ask you, since you said you use your children to test this out as lab rats, I think you said, how did they react to exactly what you said? And we've seen this, my wife and I, in our own family. You kind of you do have a policy, or this is how we're doing it, but life changes. They get older, new technologies come out. Or you just say, hey, this isn't working. Like, we thought this was okay. And you have to go to the children and say, okay, we're having to revise things. Right now, you were allowed to do this. It's not you did anything wrong, maybe necessarily, but we just realized this environment is not good. How did your children take that when you had to adjust things in light of the environment not working?
That's actually a brilliant question. It's far more important than people may realize. The answer is awesome. Okay. The answer is awesome. And it's this: if you do that infrequently, if you amend your system, if you discuss the rules infrequently, it's miserable. If you amend, if you tweak, if you revise, if you discuss, if you enforce regularly, it's a piece of cake. Okay. So it's like, I used to ride horses a lot, and the whole point in breaking a horse is to desensitize it. All right. So if a horse has never seen like a plastic bag laying on the ground, it looks like a foreign object that came from outer space, and it absolutely freaks out and it'll throw you. One of the ways you desensitize a horse, you could take plastic bags, trash bags, rub it all over the horse. And so it just slowly like gets desensitized. I used to take a remote control car and drive it in and out of my horse's legs to settle that horse down. It broke a remote control once, and it was not fun. I had to go home and tell my kids that their remote control car, true story. But desensitizing by frequency, right? So when you're dealing with the technology, you're right, Brian. The kids get older, new technology comes out, things change, standards loosen. All of this is normal. So you have to do it frequently. And the family meetings is when that comes up. Case in point, Sunday night, we have our family huddle, which is one of the agendas that I suggest people have on Sunday nights, is to get the logistics set up for the upcoming week. And my 12-year-old said, hey, Dad, Mom told me to ask you something in our next family meeting. Right away, I was like, it's working. It's working, And so I said, what's that, honey? And this is an amazing kid, right? This kid's like born without original sin. She's amazing. Imelda Rose. And she said, my friends all have cell phones, and I would like to get the Gab phone, which is like a dumbed down phone that doesn't have real internet, but they can text. And she's like, I'd like to start texting my friends. And then we had a little discussion about it. And the answer for her was, no, you're going to wait till you're 13 to get a Gab phone where you can only text your friends that we approve of. So you got to wait another 6 months, my love. I love you to death, but that's the policy. And she's like, okay, but we had a meeting. She knew that was the place to bring it up. I heard her argument for it, and the answer was no, and she accepted it perfectly well. But the frequency of us talking about technology makes it easier to look at your little girl and say, no, I'm sorry. That's not our policy. So if you don't do it all the time, it's miserable and you have World War III with your kids, and they'll cheat, and if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. But if you make it frequent, you make it a regular point. And Brian, moms and dads need to talk to their teenagers, especially, about the threats of pornography on a regular basis. And the more you talk about it, it makes it a little bit more comfortable, because it's awkward as hell to talk about. I mean, no doubt about it. No dad wants to have that conversation. But if you do it regularly, it makes it easier. You can check your kids' phones. You can put software on it to protect. You have to bring those barriers down. It's really important in today's world. I'm sorry, mom and dad, that we live in that world, but you do. And the desensitize your children by having these conversations all the time.
No, excellent advice. It's funny. I've talked to some parents, who think, well, you don't have to explain things to children if they just have to obey. And I've tried to talk to them and say, look, when they're 3 months old or 6 months old and they're reaching their hand in the electric outlet, yeah, I get it. You don't have a whole conversation about why this is, imprudent. You just stop them and you correct them. But as they get older, in addition to just the practicality of talking about things, you really give me an opportunity for them to explain the purposes, for you to talk about the purposes behind. These are not just rules because we want to make you different from your friends, but these are the values, these are the rules, and ultimately that's what I think you want to do, because these children are going to grow up and leave you, and if they just were following the rules because they were told to, as opposed to being part of that, feeling a part of the process, feeling engaged in it, to understand why mom and dad set these rules or have these policies, I think is another benefit out of having these regular meetings or encounters with it.
I can't say it better myself. Like, especially I've found it, like when the kids are even upper elementary school, they're able to really participate in these family meetings, and they have an innocence and an insight sometimes into family dynamics that you and me miss because we're busy dads. And so you got to be creative, mom and dad, to kind of draw this out of and let the kids participate. But this isn't just for mom and dad. Don't do these family meetings. Don't fill out these tools just in a vacuum, mom and dad. You can, but if you're able to incorporate the younger kids in there, the better. And I have I think it's page 86, because I have to refer to it all the time. But there's a tip in there about how to engage teenagers, because, the good teenager or the bad teenager can show up. You never know. And so there's rules. I came up with the tips, and I know they work from experience, how to get your good teenager to show up at family meetings, because when the bad one shows up, it's miserable. Miserable. So
no, and it's true. Having sort of meetings to talk about these things, you learn about your children. I mean, we had a bit of a crisis with something that happened in our family. And I remember we were talking, mostly the older children were talking, but our youngest son, joined the conversation, entered, and I really learned. I was like, wow, he is very perceptive about human emotion and behavior. Like something he had just on that age of getting older, but something you wouldn't have seen out of that context, the perceptiveness, to sort of listen to everyone else and then say, well, this is what I think is driving this person, et cetera.
Beautiful.
But I'd like to talk about, since you brought up getting them to come to the meetings, I'm sure you must have, if you did, how do you deal with the child or children that you introduce these things, say, oh, this is just stupid. This is dumb. You just read this dumb book, and now we have to do these dumb things and fill out these forms. Any advice on how to deal with that reaction?
Yeah, it's on page 73 of my book, Tips for Engaging Your Teenager in Family Meetings. But, I was looking it up right here. But here's the gist of it. I have failed at this. I've learned the hard way. So if you say, we're having a family meeting, sit down, and they have a sense that this is just going to be a reprimand, the bad teenager is going to show up every time. And then I've had 2 kids, one who's married now and one who's in seminary. Over the years, I had to fire them out of the family meetings because the attitude was so bad and it was influencing the little kids. Right. So I'm like, you know what? You're tanking this thing. Get out. You're done. You get out. So people say, well, you can't fire your kids. Well, you kind of can. I fired them out of that meeting, but so I've learned stupid. I was the stupid one, not them. So if I go to an older kid Brian.
Mhm.
Let's say you got a 16-year-old and they're the ones who are going to say, this is stupid, and you go to them a week before, 2 weeks before the meeting,
Hmm.
and you say, hey, son, we're going to have this family meeting. Number one, it's not a discipline meeting. We're not there to discipline. I'll discipline you, but not in the meeting. That's not what the meeting's for. Okay. Number two, I really need your help in this. You've had a front row seat to my stupidity for 16 years. Okay. And I want you to really contribute to this to help me make this family better. You're not a little kid anymore. You're not a full grown adult, but you got serious input on the strengths and weaknesses of our family. So I want you to think about X, Y, and Z. And then you give them a task to go think about. I want you to think about maybe what the digital policy should be. I want you to think about what our quarterly goals as a family could be. I want you to think about what our core virtues could be, or core values. I like to call them core virtues. I want to give them a task and say, think about this over the next week. And then when they show up at the meeting, you got to pray for your kid before, pray that the good teenager shows up, and then pray for them during the meeting. And if they have a bad attitude, you just got to be creative in trying to work through it. But when you give them a heads up and you give them a task and you pray for them. So, number one, give them a heads up. This is coming. Number two, I'd say do not discipline. That's not the purpose of this meeting. Discipline them another time. Number three, give them a task to perform in the meeting. Number four, pray for them. Brian, you got a 95% chance that the good teenager is going to show up.
Hmm. No, that's very, very sound advice. And particularly the last point. A lot of parents forget that. I mean, I know a priest who once told me the prayers of parents for their children are the most efficacious. Like you
Mm,
have the ability to pray for your child like no one else can
yeah,
pray for them. But it's so easily forgotten. I think you're right.
absolutely.
Well, thank you. This has really been a great conversation. To our viewers, we've not really even scratched the surface of this here. There's a lot. You see, we only just touched on a few little parts of this. The book is a well-ordered family. The website, Well Ordered Family, is got a lot of resources. You referred a few of them. I took a look around the website. A lot of resources, a lot of free things you can just download and put into practice. I really recommend reading the book before you do that because it helps put it in context. But once you do, again, a lot of these resources to work your way around here.
And I'll
Um,
just add, Brian, that like if you do the free assessment, if you go up, there's a free assessment test under free resources.
mhm.
That's a great place to start, where it's like a 5-minute assessment test, and you take that test, and then you can have a 30-minute free consultation with us, and we talk about how you scored and what the strengths and weaknesses of your family are according to these 6 parts. It's fun. Everyone likes assessment tests. They're your answers. We're not
Yeah.
judging you. And then you can talk to us about it over a Zoom call for totally free and see if we can help you out.
And you heard that. He said totally free. There's not a lot of places that will do something totally free. So that's wonderful. Again, a lot of resources and definitely recommend the book. A lot of good advice. I mean, our children are mostly all out of the house. We have a few more, but a lot of good advice I wish I had had years ago when we were dealing with some of these issues. So, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for all your resources. And it's been wonderful having you uh, discuss this with us. Is there any I'll give you kind of the last word, any parting thoughts you'd like to share?
I'll just tell parents to kind of feel empowered, feel emboldened to be the visionary and the architect of your family. Do not become a victim of the modern world. We feel helpless, we feel out of control, we feel being pulled and pushed in so many directions. And it's true, but do not lie to yourself that you're a victim. It's your family. God gave you authority over your family, and you have to take ownership of it. I will provide you some of the tools to help you do that, but you cannot outsource this, folks. You cannot pay someone else to go do this. You are the visionary, you are the architect. You must envision what God wants of your family, and you must build that. And if you use these tools as the foundational natural realm, Holy Mother Church will pour the grace on you like a tsunami, and you'll go places you never thought you could.
Well, thank you for those great words, and thank you to our viewers and listeners. And as always, you can support our apostolate by subscribing to our monthly newspaper, which you can find on our website, catholicfamilynews.com. So thank you, Connor, and hope to see you
Thank
again in
you.
the future.
I'd love to come back. Thanks, Brian.